So a while ago, me and my friends were discussing guns from video games, particularly the Metroid one, Samus's arm cannon, how cool that would be to make. And it got me thinking, and Googling, there are some models of this online. I could actually make this. So I sat down, decided to do it, got the models online. Question is, what do we put in it? I thought about a flamethrower or some other fun gadgets. Eventually settled on a Nerf gun. It's safe, and I can take that around to places and not like violate local laws. So let's make a Samus Metroid arm cannon with a Nerf gun in it. Okay, so here's a couple of models I downloaded from Thingiverse, and I can show in the corner of the screen what the final model of this one looked like. I actually have been unable to find this one again. It may have been taken down. But let's compare them. This one on the left is much thicker than this one on the right. But it has a very sharp end. It's symmetric. It's got this sort of rocket pattern both sides. They're both just empty tubes. Let's look at this one. We've got the rocket pattern on one side, not on the other. We've got this big triangle flares. There's other surface detail if we zoom in here, like these lines, these curves. This is a rod that's supposed to be in the middle. Some oval shapes here. Because it's got this built-in sort of elbow hole here, and on the other side, I think this is going to be easier to work with, and it looks proportionately longer for its diameter. So I'm going to stick with this one. So if I'm going to work with this, what do I need to do? Where's the best spot to start? It comes in 3 parts already, which I can show. Let's get rid of the peg. Part 1, let's call it the elbow. Part 2, this sort of middle bit here. And part 3, the end with these channels, I want to say, and the firing part. So given that this is all basically a tube, I think I found the best place to start was to see what sort of electronics I could fit in the end. Like, let's print a test piece of this end, just part 1 here, and see how everything fits in. All right, so I've done some modeling to see, try and fit some electronics in. The best parts are these ovals, and as you can see, I've put some clips on one of them and taken the top off to sort of have a cap that opens up to get to the electronics, and I can fit some Arduino boards into there. And in the other end, we can put the motor driver. In this central rocket shape on the inside, I've cut that out so we can fit a battery in there. Looking at this cap, I've made some holes for magnets so that this can magnetize onto the top, and then there's an extra magnet so a Hall effect sensor can read that to tell when we've put the cap on or not. And here's how it all fits in. I'm quite pleased with this initial fit. You can see that there's the switch near the top, the battery in this rocket part, the circuit board that will hold a lot of the connections basically, and motor driver in the bottom. The bit where the cap comes off to hold the Arduinos is at the top. You can't really see it in this shot. Okay, knowing how everything fits in the end, again, part 2, this is just an empty tube. You know, whatever I have to fit the Nerf gun in. Let's focus on part 3. Let's get rid of those. How do we put a Nerf gun in here? So I bought I don't remember what type of Nerf. I bought a flywheel Nerf gun. I'll put an image on the screen. And I cut the flywheel out and measured its size. I also went to Home Depot and measured various tubes that would fit over my arm. Turns out that having a diameter of 4 inches fits both best. I can shove the Nerf gun flywheel right up against this cone here, and if I sort of extend some of these blank parts, like this strip here and this strip here, where there's sort of no added detail, then I can get the length I need. So I started modeling how to put some mounts for the Nerf gun. into here, printed some test pieces, put the flywheel in, and started to see how it would mount and wire up. Let's take a look. All right, so this fits quite nicely. There's a few mounts at the bottom. I've got it braced either side, and there is just like a millimeter of room for those wheels to spin without knocking the edge. One thing I noticed only too late, unfortunately, is that there are those inset channels on the outside, right where I put the flywheel on the inside, and I want LEDs on the other side of that. So I should have rotated everything, but I noticed that too late, and I'd already had too much designed. Before we go further, I need a good, nice way of feeding the Nerf balls into this. So let's start designing the barrel and the feeder mechanism. So here's the final version. After I started making the tube, you can see that it goes from about the center all the way up, drops balls right before the flywheels where they can get pushed in somehow, and it follows up beside my arm. So if I put my fist in to hold this crossbar, then the barrel fits nicely on the other side and balls can roll down that and get pushed into the flywheel. There's just enough room for all this to fit. It's a very tight space. So next we need to design a mechanism that will take the balls that have rolled out the end, and because they can get a little stuck, and push them into the flywheel one by one whilst blocking others. So I had to cut out the middle of the flywheel to make room for a servo. It's going to have an arm that swings forward and pushes a ball in whilst blocking the next one down. It's involved just a lot of cutting and hacking through plastic. All right, here's first attempt at the mechanism. You can see a servo with a big wide arm there that can swing down the center where I've cut out some plastic. Here's the final brace that I have for the flywheel. So you can clips into the pins and is braced on the back. This arm sits on the servo horn. We'll swing forwards and push the balls in. You can see it sticks up enough so that the next ball can't fall down. So let's put that back in there. Right now this just slots on because it's a test piece. The final piece will obviously wrap around the whole way and it screws on to that cone. I went through several designs of these particular horns, whether to make them thicker or thinner, how far forward, do they attach onto the existing servo horns, or do I just print something around them? After several iterations, I went with the one with the thick head and screwed onto the pusher. All the other electronics you see there is basically just voltage regulator to power the Arduino. The Arduino is controlling the servo with a button, and then there's also a PWM signal going through a motor driver to the flywheels just to make them spin up at a particular speed. One problem with this though is it was very loose on the servo and kept popping off from the pressure from the balls, so I need to figure out a way to brace the pusher from the other side. I also need a little cap on the end of the pipe going towards the flywheel so that the balls couldn't just pop out into that empty space. So I put another piece, glued another piece onto the other side of the flywheel, attached that to a bearing, and just put that on a stand. The servo pusher couldn't come off the servo, it would just roll against that bearing. And let's see some tests. Put a few balls in. Connect to battery. Connect it the right way round. And fire up the servo. All right, it pushes balls through well. And you can't really see it here, but the wheels are firing. You saw that ball go away. This worked. I'm quite happy. Next thing to try is to put LEDs into the end cap now that I've got all the other stuff in. So I just put them on the inside next to these channels. And because I use white PLA to print all this, they shine through quite nicely. And they're dense enough that I can make some fancy animations like this pulsing. And then we have other animations. We have this is the firing pin. So charging.
it'll look better once it's all in, and then when it fires, and so on. Alright, so tape isn't good, so I printed these. It's just like 80mm by 10mm by 1mm as a rigid backing. So to basically just keep them all equidistant when I stick the new tube on, so that they come up properly and don't bend. So I've got the last one printing now. Let's get those stuck on and see how it looks.
Alright, so I put all the LEDs on those red strips, stuck them in. They sit there quite nicely, they stay rigid. So let's screw all the other tube parts on, put it all together finally. Well, not all together, put the pieces we have. So we've got to pull all the wires through. We've got the servo wire, the motor powers, and the button controls, and of course the LED wires. And these just have, it sits on very tightly. I had to scrape some of the motors off to make it fit. And then there's screw joints between each piece. So here we have that piece stuck together with the animations glowing, and I put some LEDs around the wrong way. Whoops. Thankfully can fix that in software. This is a view from inside. I'm quite pleased with how this is turning out. It's got the right glow. It glows through the PLA just enough. Everything fits with barely enough room to spare. So let's see it firing. Nope. It doesn't always fire. There are occasional errors where the ball gets stuck. This is something that I haven't figured out exactly what happened. But there we go. It can still work. Now that works, let's put all the rest of the pieces on. So this comes after the holder piece, just extends the barrel, and I've made a hole so that you can put balls in the barrel about halfway through, halfway near the end. What I really should have done retrospectively is allow a spot for it to slip a nut in or make the holes tighter. These are very loose holes, and I have to hold a nut on the other side, which makes them very difficult to screw in. So now that we've got a whole lot of function done and we're getting back towards the elbow parts, we need to consider some of these finer details. If you look at this 3D model I found online, it's got a lot more detail than my original one has. It's got a few holes. For example, there's these hexagonal parts, those holes in the triangles, and those little lines drawn along the back. I'd like to have something similar. I think all of this adds character and realism to it. So I think I'm going to take what we see here, those ellipsoidal holes, the hexagonal parts, the holes in the triangles, and those little lines. Let's try and add them to my model. Adding all these tiny little details was a bit of a nightmare in Fusion, but I think the end result that came out is really, really good. The little details just add something to the final design that is difficult to describe, but you really need. This was tricky to do in Fusion, all these little bits, because it's not my model, which means I've got all the import artifacts and everything, but I managed to bash through some of the simple ones enough. The lines certainly were a lot easier than some of the finer curves and so on. So finally we've done all that. Let's go on to printing it. These were immense prints. Yeah, 1 day, 2 hours, almost 300 grams. This was a big print, and I had a lot of failures. Finally got part of it printed, since I had to do it in 2 takes. Let's put all the wires through, all the electronics, and get that screwed on, and see how it looks. To do it in 2 pieces, I essentially just cut it down the middle at a reasonable point to make it flat, printed the 2 of them. One took, as you saw, 1 day and 2 hours. It took so long that if it messed up at the last second, it was just really frustrating. So just cut the time in half, print it 2 pieces, a lot easier. But now we finally have the Nerf ball barrel done. You can see the ball popping out at the input point there, and I've got a cap that's going to sit on the end. We still haven't got the elbow part for the electronics to fit on. So balls have to be inserted in the side, and the spring will be held back while we do this. Let's get the cap. So I've got a pusher piece with a little T-joint that comes out the top to hold, that sits at the front of the spring, and that pushes the Nerf balls through. And then I've got an end cap that holds the other end of the spring and clips onto the other end. This is so that we can pull the whole spring out if something gets stuck or if maintenance is needed. There's no other way for the spring to get out. And then to reload, we pull that T-joint back, slip it in a little notch, and then we can put balls in the reloader hole. Let's finally put the elbow piece on and get it all together. This was a bit annoying to screw on because there's no nice hole in the side. Perhaps I should have put a window in to do so. I just had to fit my arm past the electronics, which meant I couldn't see anything. And then let's put the electronics in. So we have the bit at the top where the two Arduinos sit. I have one controlling the screen and inputs, and another, well, the screen and the screen inputs, and the other controls the lights and the servo for the motors. Since the three of those two things, screen, lights, and servos, can't all fit together on one Arduino, I have to do them over two. I could get a big enough Arduino, but I didn't. And then have the other connection circuits of just like various pull up and down resistors for buttons and stuff. The motor driver at the bottom, the power switch, and then the battery. All of that screws together in the same way. And now it's all together. Here's a look down the tube. It's a spaghetti mess of wires. And up here, we have the screens with cannon power, LED brightness. I've got a color for the suit because that's a future project. We're not dealing with that yet. You can modify the strength in case you don't want to hurt someone. And when we have a Hall effect sensor for the magnets, so that when we put the cap on, the screen turns off. Power saving! I also theoretically wanted a battery voltage reader. I didn't get it working and kind of just left it on the display. But there we go. That is the full thing. Let's fire it. Woo! Alright, so, ooh, there are some loose pieces in here, which isn't good. Here it is, all finally together in one piece. And what's next is painting. But I don't just want to paint this, as I've seen online and in various blogs and stuff, you've got to sand it down first because it's got this rough surface. I don't know how well that can be seen. Whatever, if you're 3D printed, you know what I'm talking about. You got to sand that surface down first, and I've still got some stuff I haven't managed to completely get rid of. And then there's various primer layers. We'll get into the paint later. I've got a whole lot of sanding to do, which also means I have to plug the holes. Alright, that's going to be a difficult one. Let's just leave that on for now. But I've got to plug some of the holes, like these, and like the front, and then get sanding. So, plug and time-lapse time. This is where all the tiny details made it a nightmare to sand, because if I don't sand them, then they have the banding of the FDM printer pattern, but I have to get the sander, so I ended up using a Dremel to get in all the little awkward spots, which isn't the same as sanding, but I've got some pieces that are sort of semi-rough to sort of get it down to at least some level of smooth, but it did run the risk of I could very easily just carve it too far. Finally, painting. So for painting, I did a layer of primer, a primer filler, just to fill all the layers, and then covered up most of it to do yellow in the little channels because I want the insides of those to be yellow and figured this was the quickest way to do them all. Rightio, so I've gone and taped up all these yellow divots, inlines, I don't know what I'm calling them, So now that all those are taped, I've preserved the yellow, and now I'm spraying it with the green over the gray. I did another coat of gray underneath just to fill all the gaps as much as I could, and then several coats of green, and then I can, once that's nice and clear, consistent, I can pull the tape off to reveal the yellow underneath. This came out quite nicely. There's a few little errors, but I'm quite happy with it. The green, however, I messed up a bit. You really got to be easy with this paint. There are some parts where it ran or it's too thin, but if I do it too, it's difficult to get just that patch if I do it too thick. So it's a difficult paint to get right. It definitely needed some practice. Once I pulled all the tape off, I just wanted to patch up some of the bits where the green had bled through or it wasn't quite accurate. So a thin paintbrush and a bit of hobbyist yellow paint did the trick quite nicely. There are a few, again, imperfections where I went over the green too much with the yellow, but there's always going to be something. And again, at the end of the day, this is tiny detail that most people won't notice, and you've just got to have the broad view of it looking right, which I think I nailed quite well. And here's the final product. I am very happy with how this turned out looks-wise. I think I did a reasonably good paint job, both with the yellow and the green, apart from a few splodges where I went a little heavy-handed, but it has the colors I want, it's got the shape I want. This is the Metroid Prime run. It's got a perfect length where it fits everything in, and it's a working Nerf gun. It just looks amazing. I am so happy with this. The LEDs shine through the paint really well. You can see down the end. And like people just are so surprised when I show this to them. And then I get to tell them it's a Nerf gun. It's amazing. Alright, the firing still buggers up occasionally. But overall, here's where it sits in my house now. And I'm very pleased with how this turned out.